Do you want to know how a comic book gets from script to finished artwork? In this video, I interviewed Justin Gray, a successful comic book writer known for his work on DC Comics' Jonah Hex. In fact, Justin showed me how a page from issue number 1 of Jonah Hex went from comic book script to final artwork. But that's not all. Justin also gave me a behind-the-scenes look at a couple of his creator-owned comics, Billy the Kit and Standstill, which similarly have a Wild West theme of lawlessness. If you're interested in checking out Billy the Kit, then you're in luck, because it's funding on Kickstarter right now. There's only a few days left, so I encourage you to click the link in the description below and join me in backing Justin's campaign. Without further ado, here is my interview with Justin Gray.
Hello?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Dude, I think we have like the same exact chair, dude.
It's close.
It's very close.
That crossbar? Yeah.
Want to just get right into it?
Yeah, let's go.
All right, let's go. I'm going to share my screen and we will get into it. So you sent me 3 scripts and we're going to go over 3 comics. And the reason, just for the folks at home, we're going to be going over this script is because there is, in Justin's work, there is you're going to see 3 themes of Wild West. The first one we're going to go over is Jonah Hex, which is a DC Comics character. It was rebooted back in the early 2000s, and that's the work you're going to see first. The second thing we're going to look at is Justin's current Kickstarter, which is called Billy the Kit. It is also about the Wild West, but this time with a rabbit. It's a talking animal comic. And then the third thing we're going to look at is a comic called Standstill, which is actually about a pandemic. And this was written before the pandemic. This was written a couple of years ago, which I find pretty awesome. But I think there's a strong Wild West theme because it's essentially apocalyptic. It is a time of anarchy, and people are just, it's almost like The Walking Dead, where people are just dealing with the situation at hand. So all 3 have a Wild West setting, and I wanted to go over these 3 today because I was just blown away by Justin's ability to write for this. He seems like his skill is honed for this particular setting. So he's obviously an expert on it. So I thought, why not pick his brain and learn what we can. What do you think? Do you want to walk me through this? I'm curious about the differences between the art and the what the actual script looked like.
I could just say that this is a long time ago, and it was very much at the beginning of my comic career where I was still holding on to. I had been writing prose for a long period of time. Mm-hmm. I love comics, but I'm guilty of the overwriting. As soon as I got into comics, I was writing stacks and stacks and captions and balloons everywhere and filling and not even conceptualizing. And it's weird because I grew up reading comics, but I never, and I feel silly saying it, but I never really put together the components of what the recipe is and how you have to have a balance of different ingredients, and you can't just consume a page of comic art with dialogue, balloons, and narration and everything else. So it took me a while to sort of grow in that direction. So what you see a lot in this early stuff is a blend of prose and cinematic elements, because I wanted it to have the feeling of being in the West and not observing the West. So I wanted people to feel like they were more in the moment than just reading about the moment. So there's just tons of stuff on the page in the script. And one of the things that's interesting about Hex is it was such a huge learning experience because up until Hex, everything had been serialized comic stuff that I was used to. And we were looking at doing this grand, opus of storyline that would stretch 12 or more issues. And Steve Wacker, who was the editor at the time, said, let's just do 1 or 2 issue storylines. Just do 1 and dones or 2 and dones. And for about 2 or 3 weeks, I was grappling with that because it was so different from where my mind was. But once I started to look at it that way and say, I only have so much space, so much real estate, so much time to tell a story, it changed, pretty much it changed everything from that trajectory on as far as the way I approached comics. I felt very uncomfortable moving forward with the larger story arcs, with the sort of drawn out, decompressed, I don't even know what you want to call it. It just didn't. And that was one of the things about Jonah Hex at the time. It was one of the few mainstream comics that was actually doing one and dones, two and dones. It was a very old school way of doing comics, because you just randomly would pick up a comic and read it, and you would get everything you needed to know about that. And you wouldn't have to know what happened 6 months ago. You wouldn't have to know the entire lineage of the character and every nuanced detail, which is where comics went for a long time. And now we're seeing that just extrapolated out unbelievably now with the films and everything else. So it was more important to me to give people something to read in a certain amount of time that was valuable to them, that was worth their time, and they didn't feel empty or they needed to go buy something else. And I know that's counterintuitive to the publishing model of you got to get everybody back every month. But my idea was, one, I thought this book was going to fail miserably. So Jimmy Palmiotti and I sat down and we said, every issue is 110% until we get canceled, which is 8 or 12. That was our baseline on that. We're like, if we get to 12, then we did our job, and we probably exceeded expectations. We never ever thought we would get to 70. So wow. That was just like one of the little things that were great about doing this. And you mentioned the Wild West and the lawlessness, and there is a lot of the main theme to me in all of these books, I think, is that when you take away the authoritarian, when you take away the structure of society, what kinds of people thrive, what kinds of people fail, what kinds of people are compassionate, what kinds of people become cruel and ruthless. Because, everyday life, everyone goes to work, they're expected to behave a certain way, they get in traffic, they're expected to behave a certain way. And I'm fascinated by when you take all that away and then they have to make their own moral decisions and judgments, the results you get in that. And one of the other things I always thought of was like, when someone's so outraged or shocked by something like a serial killer in the modern age, can you imagine when no one was watching, when it took 6 months to get a newspaper, when there were no media outlets, there was no news except for gossip, the kinds of things that people got up to and got away with. So a lot of that stuff started to flourish and grow in the Jonah Hex run that we had.
So I have a viewer who is working on a Western. Okay. And for me, I've never written a Western before. But if I were to approach it, I think like the first thing I would do would just try to study up on the Old West. I know that there's a lot of Civil War history, and I know there was a lot of westward expansion. That's where the Oregon Trail came from, people moving out west. So, and then you have movies about basically the idea of little by little the law taking over, and then eventually the law took it over. But in that space and time, figuring out a story, what was your process? And I really think it's awesome that every episode is different. I love how they feel like one shots, and I don't have to know all this backstory. That's a burden, to be frank. So I'm curious about this particular story and how you came up with that. But just generally speaking, how do you come up with a Western sort of a story? Like what are the ingredients, if you will, if there is such a thing?
Well, you touched on two things, and one of the things that I probably, without it, like, you take a certain satisfaction in knowing you hit on something that really feels good and feels right, feels organic. And one of the things from the beginning was the idea that most of these characters, and whether they're Opani, Spider-Man or whatever, you have an inroad to their thought process. And it's a very intimate thing. It's captions. It's you're in their head. And what I really liked about doing Jonah Hex was you couldn't get in his head. You could only make a determination based on the facts in front of you, based on what people did, which I thought was so much more interesting and challenging to write, because it's easy to just fill in the reader's gaps. It's easy to say it was rainy and I was sad. You know, it's easy to say I was emotionally disturbed by this moment, this thing I walked in on. And it's a completely different thing to have the character behave in a way that's a complete reaction to something, without the sort of emo elements of it. And I don't mean it like, I just mean like you don't have that pathway in there. And I always like my mental rule, and Jimmy and I had talked about it, was that you don't get in Hex's head, Hex gets in your head. And so you're constantly trying to figure out what he's doing. And for a Western, I think when you look back at these stoic characters, and you talked about research and you'd never written a Western, and I'm like obsessive compulsive about those elements of history and, you know, accuracy, but not accuracy to the point of it's a textbook. It's like you know, it's not that. I just want to make sure that I'm at least in the spirit of something. So there's this, one of the themes that runs in a lot of the Jonah Hex and carries over into different books is things like, there's an old film called The Petrified Forest, which is Humphrey Bogart, Leslie Howard, and Betty Davis. And it's one of the first modern Westerns. It was a stage play, and then they made the film out of it, and then they made another film, which I don't know why they made that one. But essentially, a bank robber and outlaw is on the run from the police, and he's trying to get to Mexico, which is, I mean, this is the 19 teens, 1920s that this was done. It shows you how long people have been trying to run away to Mexico. And the idea was that he's running away to Mexico, and he's this bad gangster. He's this dangerous person, but you don't really get into his head, and that's Bogart's character. He's Duke Mantee. He's this character who's larger than life, and you only get what the world tells you about him and not what he tells you. So you only see in his actions. With the Western, with the stoic old American hero, it's a mythology. It doesn't mean it even happened. But with Jonah Hex and with certain elements of Billy the Kit when he gets older, and with certain elements you see with characters in Standstill, I really am attracted to that. Less is more. The reveal of who they are is based on how you perceive them. To me, that's what an American Western is. That's the silent thing with Shane at the end of that film. That's the 15 to 16 minutes of Once Upon a Time in the West, where there's no dialogue. There's just music, whistling, and harmonicas. So that's in this opening scene, even though there's a lot of narration, you can see there's a lot of storytelling with the money in the air and the difference between people. You see all the bodies. And what we have here is we have a situation where Jonah Hex and this person are having a standoff, and there's obviously a lot of stakes involved. And it's not just the money that's flying around. It's that this young guy who just thinks, you know, we got everything, we got the money, we can split the money, and whatever it took to get the money doesn't mean anything. And what do you care? You're just a cold-blooded bounty killer. But Hex has this morality that says you have to do things a certain way, right or wrong. Even if doing the wrong thing is the way to get the right results, that's how he operates. So while he's having this conversation with this guy, he's saying this guy made a moral choice that was wrong. He made a moral choice related to a Native American tribe of Apache that he thinks is nothing. He thinks it doesn't mean anything. He has no sense of honor. And Jonah Hex, despite what horrible person he is, still maintains that sense of honor. And so he's pushing that honor back on this kid. And he's saying, what do you care about an Indian? And of course, the backstory, as we later find out, if you don't know anything about Jonah Hex, is that he has a history with Native Americans, and especially in a lot of stuff that I like to do. I like the gray area. I like that things aren't black and white. Mm-hmm. I like that you can't just draw a line between good and evil.
Oh yeah.
Because life doesn't work that way. It doesn't have to be boring. It doesn't have to feel like you can't escape from life, but it also feels more genuine to me that it mirrors life in this. It's a Western. It's not a superhero story to me, which you can go one way or the other if whatever your taste is on that. But for this particular thing, the heroes aren't always heroes, especially with Westerns, especially with the kinds of Westerns that I like. The heroes do bad things, the villains do good things. And at the end of the day, there's only the code that says, did you step over the line? Did you do the right thing or the wrong thing when the opportunity presented itself? And I wish more people were like that in life. I think that's probably where that comes from for me. I look at things and it's very clearly a right and a wrong, but it's so hard to do the right thing all the time. And sometimes, doing the right thing means doing the wrong thing.
One thing that stuck out to me here that wasn't in the script is that we have this close up. We have these two close, and I like how the way you, for a lot of this, we're going to see in later scripts how some of your scripts are very, very tight. Others of them are say you're basically like, artists have at it, and it's interesting in seeing the.
I didn't even send you like the really have at it ones either.
Oh, yeah?
I didn't want to do any spoilers.
All right.
Definitely from this point to what I've been doing now, it's very different, especially with Standstill. I can write an issue of Standstill, I feel like, in about 4 hours, because I'm going through scenes in my head and I know that the artist is going to feel liberated and wanted to go a certain way. And then when I don't even write dialogue half the time in those, there's this play, I think, I'm trying to think of what issue it was I wrote recently. It was probably issue 6, where there's almost no dialogue for 24 or 26 pages.
Whoa.
And then I just went back in with the artwork and I just wrote over the artwork.
It's very Marvel method of you.
I mean, I can't do it with everyone for sure. And it's funny because it used to make me crazy when I would do these detailed scripts and I would get back pages that didn't follow the script at all.
Wow.
And then I would have to go in and piecemeal what had been drawn, because sometimes that would happen and there would be conflict and the artist wouldn't want to draw or redraw anything. And you would say, well, this is an important beat. That was an important beat. But I don't fully do that anymore. Sometimes it has to be very, very specific to where it's going so that I know that the artist understands that something that's happening in issue 3 is going to pay off in issue 7. But other than that, I have been doing just like almost just scene description.
I'm curious. So did you start in like when you're working for DC Comics or, one of the main publishers, they probably want it very tight. They don't really, whereas I know that, are there writers at these houses who do work very loose too? What do the publishers expect from that regard?
I feel like I always feel like I'm like the misunderstood troublemaker, because I don't. I would write scripts and sometimes I would get notes back and saying, we don't do scripts like this. This is how we do scripts. And you go through and you number, for instance, with this page you have up here now, the narration is, and for certain editors, I would have to write 1 narration, 2 narration, 3 narration, 4 narration. And then it would be the same thing would be for dialogue. I'd have to start over. So you'd have these different beats, and that was an older style. And I just kind of always felt like if I can get the message across to the artist, then the format on this page that no one would normally see until they started doing director's cuts and putting scripts out there, and more people wanted to see the process. To me, it didn't really matter. It was just about, but at the end of it, I think it just came down to editorial wanting to quickly get through the checking process between the art and the lettering. But I don't know how many people go back to that Stan Lee style anymore, where Stan would just write, this is what happens in Silver Surfer number 5, and then hand it off and wait for John or Jack to just draw everything, and then Stan would go in and rework it to what was drawn. That's something that if you get the right person, for me, is very exciting. So when I find the right person, and they appreciate it, when I know that I have an artist that appreciates me doing that style, and I know that they're not going to come back to me with something that's not even relevant to what's happening, then I don't mind. Like, I really want the artist to be passionate and excited to work on it, because it shows up on the page, and it shows up in ways that you don't necessarily expect or see when you're writing it. I said today that it's interesting when you look at webtoons and people doing comics on their phones or Tumix, where you get an instant understanding of pacing because you're scrolling. There's a rhythm to the scrolling, as opposed to, there's a rhythm to reading, but they're different. And with scrolling, you're like, everything's a beat, everything is immediate. And you don't necessarily get that when you're sitting down and writing a script until you see the artwork, because every art, especially with something like Jonah Hex, where we wrote 70 issues and had 50 different artists.
I think that's great information. It's I think if you go to, I think it's the Comics Experience, or Comics Experience, they have if you go to Comics Experience, and I know people from home will appreciate this, and then you go to resources and then scripts. This is Andy Schmidt's school, by the way.
Okay.
You have they have some lists of different writers you can go to, and over here they have
I just saw Paul Jenkins. Paul Jenkins, wrote some of my favorite scripts to read.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
All right, I'm gonna have to check some of those out. But this is what they, just like you were saying, the numbered panels. This is what you were talking about, right?
Yep.
And this looks like something that you'd this looks very, very systematized, and I think it's unique that if you're running a big business, I can appreciate. But for me, I'm literally writing bullet points. Oh, that's all I need.
Right.
So I guess I think that's cool. I'm sorry, what was the name of the individual again? You said who you?
Oh, I saw you scroll by Paul Jenkins. When I was working at Marvel Knights, Paul was doing the Inhumans, and it was the first time I had read. Actually, when I worked at Marvel Knights, it was the first time I read comic scripts. So I was reading Kevin Smith, I was reading Christopher Priest, I was reading Paul Jenkins, and it was interesting to me because I had never really even had experience reading scripts before. So when I read Paul's stuff, and immediately you see Paul's talking to the artist, and some writers will just write the script, and other writers will Paul has a very he likes to take moments to put jokes in there that aren't actually in the script. It's just they were a fun read, and everyone's different. But I definitely looked at the way that Priest and the way that Jenkins wrote their scripts as my first exposure to, and Kevin Smith's scripts I read for Daredevil. Christopher Golden was doing Punisher at that time, and I really didn't know what that was like. So it was interesting to me. All of a sudden, I was kind of seeing behind the curtain in a way that just my brain wasn't aware of. So,
yeah, versus screenplays, which is extremely structured. Right. There's only one way to write it. But I think there is a bit of liberation in there. So how do you go from Jonah Hex to is not to offend you, but like a Bugs Bunny meets like Jonah Hex type of thing?
No, I'm not offended by that at all, because I had Hex had ended. I had done Jonah Hex, and then Jimmy and I worked together again on All-Star Western for 2 years. But it was a very different animal. It was a very different thing. It was New 52. And the thing with Hex is they used to leave us alone. And then when it became New 52, there was a lot of editorial involvement because it was a part of the moving process of the whole publishing plan. So when that ended, I kind of was like, okay, I don't want to do another Western for a while. And then I don't remember what happened. It was maybe a year or so later. This idea popped in my head of doing a Western that was an animal Western, because I didn't want to go back, and I felt like anything I did that was even remotely close to Hex would just be compared to Hex. And the idea was I have never done a comic with animals in it. And I love Watership Down. That was like a huge influence on me as a kid. It was one of those movies that scared the hell out of me and also got my brain thinking, and was very emotional. And for some reason, all these different elements, and that's what happens. You read things, you watch things, and they sort of gather in your head and percolate, and eventually sort of spew out weird things. And the weird thing was a Western with talking animals where the impetus in most Westerns is revenge. Something terrible happens, and it's like every country song, you know, somebody runs over your dog or your truck breaks down, you know, something happens, and you have the character go from this sort of tranquil life, even with Unforgiven, when you see that Clint Eastwood's character is trying to settle down and put his old bad habits behind him and raise a family, and he's still having hardships, his wife dies. But there's an inciting incident that's who that character is, and they just have to go be that character. They can't run from who they are. They can't hide from who they are. And the idea of Billy just came from this sort of, I wanted to do this Afro Samurai, this after midnight stoner animated thing. But then I thought, what if the inciting incident with this particular character was tornadoes, because tornadoes are such a huge part of the Southwest and the South and the West. And the idea of the tornado being a sentient thing, that there being some physical thing, because tornadoes are just an act of God. But what if the act of God was an actual God that was just doing terrible things to people? And so it grew from there. It grew from just being a rabbit who was pissed off and wanted revenge to being this sort of whole world with a backstory and a mythology that I didn't realize until I started working on it.
So really, real quick for the folks at home, I just want to discuss this. First of all, you go ahead and you have this like letter to your writer, to your artist, and you say, Barry, I want you to focus on emotion cinematography. I think we have a very narrow window of opportunity here, given that this is a talking animal comic. That doesn't mean we can't make every panel a memorable experience. In fact, we have an obligation to do it. I'm partial to the idea that Billy's father dresses like Guy Pearce in the movie Brimstone, only he's a rabbit.
Right.
I love it. So I love that. So I'm curious what you meant by a window of opportunity. You mean like the first page, capturing people from the first page, like making it pop off? Is that what you meant?
I meant the whole thing. I mean, it's rabbits, it's goats, it's something that is easily misinterpreted as kid stuff or silly stuff, or that it shouldn't be taken seriously, that they won't be invested in it, or that, I don't know. I just think, I mean, I've seen it, and I said to everyone from the beginning, as you see here, it's a talking animal comic. There's an expectation, and there's a group of them that do really well, and then there's a whole cemetery full of dead talking animal comics that just never went anywhere. I mean, not everyone can be Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Not everyone's We Three or Mouse, or you know, I don't like to name things in a negative way, or point out, you know, stuff with people that's negative in terms of names and book stuff. But it's a very narrow margin of success. And the idea was that immediately people have to understand that this is not what they think it is. This is not the Muppets. This is not, you know, this is not a kid-friendly thing, which Watership Down is not. Watership Down is a very unnerving, and for little kids in the 70s, it was terrifying. There's death, there's loss, there's emotional grieving, there's torture, there's violence. It just happens to all be animals. And the book is great, and they made the animated thing, and it was, I think, I think this and Ricky Tikki Tavi came out around the same time, and I was very impressionable to all that.
I saw that when I was a kid. Like
Yeah,
same
so
animation
somehow it
style.
just kind of all resurfaced. And rabbits are supposed to be weak, and they're basically food. And I thought the interesting thing would be that in this particular universe, that rabbits are the most dangerous thing, but they don't want to be. They're trying to live and be rabbits, and eat vegetables and start families, big families, and live their lives. But for some reason, they also have this ability to wield this great power. That's the power of light against darkness. So that was stuff that started to happen. And I wanted to do a sympathetic character, and I wanted to do a character of faith, even though, again, when we were talking earlier about writing stuff that's not my agenda, I thought it would be interesting for me creatively to write about something that's not me. So you have these deeply spiritual rabbits. The father's a preacher. He's teaching his kid to grow up, and it's about God and doing the right thing. And Billy has to run up against the fact that life isn't fair over and over again. But his father instilled in him to have faith in God. So his faith in God is what puts him at odds with these old gods. And that when you talked about the idea of people coming from Europe and Manifest Destiny and the Oregon Trail and all that, there were people here, and there were people here who had beliefs and lives and families and social structures. And I thought it was interesting that here these rabbits are coming from another continent, bringing their god with them. And these old gods were not happy about it. And so they decided that there was going to be a line drawn. And it just so happens that these old gods, the majority of them are dark, dangerous, evil monsters from another dimension. And these little rabbits are the last line of defense. And it turns out that Billy has this gift, and Billy is the last of what's called the Sunslingers, which are these rabbits that are able to wield the fire that was given to people from Prometheus. So I like to mix different religions and concepts together. And that's where that all started to happen. And it just so happened that it was just talking animals and rabbits. And I wanted to do something too that you couldn't put a label on it, that it was belonged to a demographic of actual people. It wasn't a gender thing. It wasn't a race thing. You could tell the stories based solely on them just being representations of people, as opposed to being recognizable groups of people where we'd say, it just makes it more open to telling a story where people aren't going to say, well, this is a representation of this group of people or that group of people, that all people are the same. And just, I think that's one of the things I like about this book in particular, is that they're just trying to live. And it doesn't matter if they're rabbits, they're bears, they're polecats or whatever. And so you can tell all kinds of stories without it being about the stigmas and the social issues that we're dealing with here in the real world.
This is relatable. Yeah, it feels very Christian, but you're right. On the flip side of it, it's just about a group of people and their religion coming up against a different situation.
Well, it's definitely the first issue, because you're seeing his family, and his family's very religious. And so then he meets Luther, and Luther's kind of like, that's all just, Luther's the antithesis of everything. He's just a grumpy old kung fu master who's like, you and your God and you and your stupid ideas. And if your family was so great, they'd be alive. And he's like, why are you torturing me like this?
Well, I did want to ask you about Luther, and this is not a spoiler, because it's in it's in the preview for your Kickstarter. But the last page, you're literally the cliffhanger section. In the script version, Luther's very nice, but then in this version, in the actual version, the word balloons, he just wants Luther bait. So for the folks at home, after Billy the Kit buries his family, because he's the last lone survivor of the rabbit family, along comes this goat. And he was a kung fu master, beats up some big feet. I actually wrote that funny, big feet. And And then he wants to follow him along and to become a a kung fu master too. And then
he meets this character and he's like, wow, this guy's like, can you teach me how to be a badass so I can avenge my family? And he's just like, I have no time. I'm like trying not to curse. That Luther curses all the time. He basically has to like, I'm not going to be nursemaid to this stupid rabbit who's so weak and pathetic and couldn't even defend his family. And Billy's like that Spider-Man character where he's like dumb Spider-Man where he just doesn't know any better. Like Spider-Man at least has like, I just, I have an obligation, but Billy's just kind of like, I'm going to get in there and I'm going to do this and you can't stop me because I love God. And Luther's just kind of like, everything you believe in is bullshit. Fall down the hill, get out of here. I don't care. Yeah.
Well, why did Luther's character turn so strong? I mean, here you have fear is just a feeling. You feel hungry, you feel anger. You call this a feeling and I call it learning. Oops, spoke too soon. Whereas to me is very much tough love, but then you get over here and he's like, happy trails, nice knowing you. And so like, where did that it went from like tough love to now just like, get away from me, you little brat. Like, what happened?
Started back if you scroll back to the Bigfoot sequence, I wrote, Luther does all this crazy stuff fighting these monsters.
Mm-hmm.
And I just said, let's just make him Bigfoot, whatever. So I didn't dialogue any of this.
Oh.
So I looked at the artwork and I dialogued it based on the artwork. And so when I was doing the fight sequence and the action sequence, I decided all of a sudden this voice started coming out in my head with what he sounded like. And in that is where he started to turn. You'll see in the story, he starts to turn more and more till we get to that final page. And then he progresses into the next script from there and so on.
All right. I like how you were putting in, I like how you're very specific. We're not going for Harry and the Hendersons here. By the way, that's a movie I saw when I was a kid. And then you putting in these reference images for your artist, which, I've heard other, big name writers say that's the thing to do, to put in reference images for
I try to. You have a fine line there because you might be inspired by another artist's work, but you obviously have to tell the artist you're working with, like, don't do that, but just get excited by it and see that Bigfoot doesn't have to look like Harry in the Head, like everyone's perception. You know what I mean? Like Chewbacca's basically Bigfoot in space, but like, don't do that. Something else. Yeah. Oh
my goodness, that's true. He is. I never put two and two together. You were the person who's you were the person.
I'm always ruining stuff for geeks because I'm always like, well, that's just Chewbacca in space is Bigfoot. I'm like, and I always get flack for that, but. Well, you're not. What goes through my brain. I can't help it.
That's so funny. Now I know I only have a few minutes left, so I want to make sure I open Standstill here because the first sequence, the opening sequence, I just love it. And by the way, I'm very upset with the ending of the last issue because I really want to know what happens next. I'm not even saying that just to like flatter you. I was just like, no, what happens to his girlfriend? Which
thank you, because that is exactly what I want.
I was upset.
That's what I've been building towards. This is the book where I just like sit there and I go, everything has to just keep going. It has to be like, someone has to be mad. Someone has to be upset. So like, I really want, there's other things like I do spicy pulp. I want people to be entertained and escape from reality. And with Standstill, I constantly just want to be like acupuncturing you and hitting nerves and twisting things on you. So yeah, that's the reaction I was hoping to get. Yeah, I mean, thank you. That's exactly the reaction I wanted. And even the artist was like, wait a second, because I don't like to give Branko a bunch of scripts at a time. I like him to do the script and then give him a new script so that like it's fresh to him. It's not something that he knows what's going to happen. So yeah, I mean, that's what this book is different from everything else that we've even discussed, which I'm sure you noticed.
But it's still the Wild West.
Well, it is. It is lawlessness. I mean, we went from a huge population to a small population, which is always where the most interesting things to me happen. Even when there's a story in a big city, really your story is involving a certain group of people. It's not involving 100,000 people because that would be unwieldy. Yeah, I mean, yeah, this is a book I'm very excited. The 5 and 6 is almost done. 6 will be done probably in a week. And so then I'm going to kickstart 5 and 6 after Billy starts shipping.
Wow.
And I'm only going to do it for 2 weeks. It's not going to be because
Really?
it doesn't. I mean, this is something I honestly I wish I was publishing this. I wish this was out in stores and not just here through Kickstarter and through my website. And now COMIXOLOGY it's on. But
what's your website?
It's jvgray.com.
Let's look that up just for the folks at home so they can go on there. jvgray.com.
Yep. And you'll get hit with the spicy pulp stuff right away.
Yeah. I mean, I can appreciate pirates because I'm writing a pirate story, or I wrote a pirate story and I'm drawing a pirate story. Where should I go next? So the store section?
You can just scroll down because you'll see the next thing.
Oh, there we go.
Is Standstill. So that is 1 through 4 on there in digital. I don't know. It's definitely a different kind of book, and it's something that I mean, people like to make connections to Walking Dead, but it's not. The only thing is it's a post-apocalyptic and it's black and white, but I think that to me is where it ends. And that's clearly not to say that I wouldn't love the comparison, because I mean, Walking Dead obviously was a huge success and really well done. But this is one of those things. It's kind of again, when I said earlier, my brain goes in certain ways. I looked at apocalyptic things and I was like, well, what about all the other stuff that happens? What about the fact that the weather, even now when we're as civilized as we are and we have all our technology, the weather can be completely devastating to us. And so that Wild West thing also comes back. I wanted it to be more like modern people got thrown into the Stone Age overnight, and how they would deal with that. And that's part of what Standstill is. It gradually becomes a world where everything that we knew and we had control of, we no longer have any control over that. We don't have power. We don't have medicine. We now have to be afraid of all the things we did to the planet, that now nuclear reactors can overflow and send clouds of radiation, Chernobyl-sized clouds. I mean, there's like 300 nuclear plants on Earth. And without everybody watering them and making sure they don't overheat. So that's the kind of stuff we don't normally see. And that's the stuff that I started putting into this book.
Now, I'm curious I don't know diddly squat about nuclear reactors, and I wouldn't even know.
I could walk to one from where I live. So that's part of it. And I could walk to a prison as well. Like a major, well-known prison is right down the street from me.
You're in New York, right?
Yep.
All right. Yeah. I noticed it says I didn't notice this. It says a romantic Greek tragedy.
Yes.
What does that mean?
I don't want to spoil too much, but you have these 2 characters that are very much in love at the beginning of the story. And again, I got in trouble this week for opening my mouth and having an opinion. Standstill starts again right in the middle of the story.
Oh yeah, it does.
There's no setup. There's no mushroom cloud in the background. There's no, Dawn of the Dead opening where there's news broadcasts and everything else. You're immediately thrown into this world, and it's as urgent and basic. Yeah, there's lions and there's crazy stuff going on, but it's about these 2. It's about Mason and Luna, and just however many days ago, weeks or whatever, they were the happiest people in the world. He asked her to marry him. She said yes. They made love and they woke up in the morning and he was fine and she was not. And there was no reason for it that he could understand. So he's a paramedic. He was a combat veteran medical officer. So he sets out on this journey because I essentially set him where I live. He realizes that there's nuclear power plants. He realizes that they're going to overheat and there's going to be radiation everywhere. Because we get brochures every single year. We get a brochure that says this is what happens if the nuclear power plant has a problem. These are the bus stops you go to if you don't have a car. These are the escape routes. This is how you get iodine and different things to deal with radiation.
Wow.
So essentially, he's like, we have to get as far away from all these nuclear power plants and all these potential hazards, toxic or otherwise. And he takes the EMS bus or the EMT bus that he has, loads her up in it, and they start driving to Oregon. Oregon Trail again, which is in the script, but I don't know how it's going to work out in the actual comic. And so this is their journey, these two lovers, and he's keeping her alive in ways that I just thought, like, what are like things that people would have to do to stay alive? She can't move. She's essentially in a coma. How does he have a mobile hospital? How does he keep her alive, keep her from having all these medical conditions? Which sounds boring as we're saying it, but as you're realizing I haven't seen an apocalyptic or post-apocalyptic or zombie or anything where they had to keep someone alive in that state the whole time. So the two of them are trying to find some kind of safe haven. He doesn't know what to do. No one, because I like the idea of not explaining everything in why this happened. It's just they're dealing with it, because that's how it would be if on something on this scale, it would happen so fast you wouldn't really know. There wouldn't be enough people left to explain it to you. So you would have your own philosophies and ideas on what happened. And because we have a culture that grew up with zombie movies, when you see a zombie thing, you can kind of figure out it was a virus or it was this or it was that. With Standstill, I wanted it to be something else. And I wanted the reader to find out as the characters find out, and the reader to hypothesize, and as the characters are trying to figure those things out as well.
Yeah, it's definitely scary. And the villain is that the villain just realizing you have a villain now who he realizes, wait, now there is no law enforcement to stop me from my evil deeds, and
I'm just indulging my whatever makes me happy. When you take away, like we were discussing earlier, we take away all civility, all punishments, all structure of society. You get good people and bad people, but like, what is bad? I read a comic today that was post-apocalyptic, and I like the comic a lot. I think the art's great, but it was all of a sudden I realized it was suffering from that. And we've seen it before, and it's the character who's like so flippant and funny, and he's like being clever because look how evil I am. And I mean, that's kind of something that Joss Whedon was doing early on in Buffy. That character, that's sort of a smart ass evil guy. And then you see some of it in Negan, some of that dialogue pacing where they're sort of over the top theatrical. And with Rhett, I didn't want him to be like that. I wanted him to be more low key and sort of slithery and insidious. And I think they worked, because I had a publisher say that it was too much with issue 2. And since you've read more than issue 2, you can see he obviously continues to be not such a nice person.
Yeah, so. I think he nailed it. Like, it was, part of me was wondering, like, why is this happening right now? Why is this in the script right now? And then you just realize, because he's going to come back later, and it's going to be I was very upset.
For years, I was always running up against conflict about villain behavior. And they would say, you can't do that. Whether it's superhero comics at DC or whatever, no, you can't do that. I'm like, it's the villain. Why? I mean, like, how are they villainous unless they do things that make an ordinary person go, oh my God, this person's so horrible. Like this like, that's villainy. It's not just mustache twirling. It's not just like, I have a plan and when you fall into my trap, but I wanted there to be like actual evil that people could actually do, not something like they turn on a device and laser beam someone in the crotch with it. I wanted it to be something, tangible. So that's why I do this, because I'm able to do it without someone going, no, that's too horrible. You can't do that.
I love it. I think you nailed it. And by the way, I love this piece of dialogue here where he's talking to the cats who are around the cans, and he says, "You guys don't rule the world yet." Now, just for the viewers, this is the very first thing he says in a word balloon form. And to me, that says so much about the fact that even the potential that cats could rule the world, because the world is such in a messed up state at his moment in time. It is just so Shakespearean of a thing to say. I thought it was perfect.
It's so cat-like too. I mean, I have cats. They act like they own everything.
You got that right. Sitting in my laundry all the time. You couldn't.
Oh man, one of them
right, dude.
in the dryer today. I had a full thing. I'm like, "Where are you going? Get out of there!"
Now I'm curious. Now I don't want to run over time. I want to be respectful of your wife's time. But real quick, you talked a little bit about how to write a Western. If you were to give advice on how to write a post-apocalyptic, because there's great stories out there that are post-apocalyptic. If you were to just give advice specifically for that genre, what would you say to that beginner writer?
You have to look at what we haven't seen, because it's such a saturated thing. Dystopian futures, apocalyptic futures. We've seen them over and over again. I've worked on several of them. Some of my own, some I did. I worked on an adaptation of the book Wool, which I loved, which was a Hugh Howey novel. Great story behind that. But you have to show people stuff that they haven't seen before. And that's hard to do when you've seen it. You got to think around. I started reading Snow Angels by Jeff Lemire, and I'm sorry I can't remember the artist's name, because I know Jeff, and there's things in that where he came up with different takes on tropes of post-apocalyptic tropes. I only read, I think, the first two issues, but there's some great stuff in there. And Jock, I can't believe I forgot it was Jock's name. But yeah, you got to show people stuff they haven't seen before. And obviously, the number one rule of any fiction is that they have to care about the characters. They have to be invested in the characters. But we've seen so many apocalyptic films for the last, 60, 70 years, that it takes effort. It takes, a certain amount of dedication to working around that.
Cool. And again, last thing, just for as far as, because you're a tremendous writer, and I know it's going to take a lot for, especially a viewer who's starting out to progress. But if you were to give advice and to the viewer just starting out, who wants to write, who wants to do what you do, or just write well, what would you say to that new person?
You got to keep doing it. You have to do it a lot, and you have to have thick skin, because no one cares, really. I know I appreciate what you're saying, but there's a whole lot of not hearing that that gets to whatever point in which you have success, whatever that success is. If you're going to write, you have to write and not worry about reviews, what people think. You have to be respectful and understand that maybe somebody has a point of view that can help you. But you have to just keep working at it and looking for ways to get better, and reading a lot and consuming a lot of material. At least for me, I constantly have to be absorbing stuff and working at it and challenging yourself. Like I said, I got in a little bit of trouble this week with my mouth, but I did it because I was looking at stuff and saying, well, it's not grabbing me. I don't know how it's grabbing other people. I don't know that people want to read this particular style of thing where one thing happens in one comic and where there are characters talking for 20 pages. Think about that. Look at what makes a great film, and I don't mean like a great film recently. Older films when they were just using techniques that everyone takes for granted now. like Kuro Kurosawa's Throne of Blood. There's cinematography and camera angles in that and drama in that you don't really see. Like that stuff, especially for comics, because it's such a visual medium, you have to be able to tell a story with pictures with no words, and then do both. Which is, which I don't know that they're teaching that. I don't know that there's even a teaching thing with that anymore. There are people who are inherently good at it, and then there are people who are inherently good. Like being good at one thing doesn't necessarily translate to being good at doing comics. And that, for me, comics and TV and comics and film are all different things. Even though there might be overlap and crossover, understand the medium of comics is different, and you have to work in a certain way that conveys and plays to the strengths of that medium.
I think that's well said, and I think I don't know what it is, and even you said it at the beginning, where there's a tendency to want to use comic books as a channel for your prose, and forgetting that it's a visual medium, and not filling it up with word balloons and captions. Would you say that's something that afflicts the younger writers?
I think there's points where people can argue that it's a stylization, or it's a trend, or like this is tastes, and tastes change over time. I don't think that there's any supplement for good storytelling, and I think it depends on how you want to make comics. It just like early at a certain point in my career was this whole push of like selling properties. Like, because there's not a lot of money in comics. I'm not gonna lie to you.
Never heard that before.
Yeah, never.
That's the first time I'm hearing this.
Yeah, sorry to burst your bubble.
Oh boy.
So there's an attraction to saying we can get a movie deal, we can get a book deal, which is a whole other conversation and pitfalls that are involved with that. But I'm definitely at the point where I've been ground up in the meat grinder of Hollywood and TV and all that stuff. So the point where I don't even think about that when I create something or I write something. I'm just writing something for the person that's reading the comic, who likes comics. And if that comic translates to something else, fine. If it doesn't, then it doesn't. As long as I did the best job I could with the comic, I'm not going to worry about if it's a tentpole idea, if it's something that has crossover appeal, because I've done those things that have crossover appeal and they go nowhere. I have one movie made. Thank you, Jay Baruchel and Kickstart Productions. And that's, that's great. And I love it. And I'm happy to have had that opportunity. But the idea of chasing that anymore to me is just, it's not worth it. It's creatively draining. It's mentally draining. It's a dog chasing its tail a lot of the times. And it's not for everyone. I mean, my story is different from everyone can have their own outcome on things. And I'm not saying that I'm right or wrong, or that I definitely don't have all the answers or even half the answers. But I decided that I was going to stay true to what I do and who I am, and write for my readers more than anything else. That's really it. The people who support my books are the only people I care about when I write something.
Hey, yeah. I know we're running over time. You have been more than generous with your time.
I appreciate you having me on.
Justin, it's been great. Thank you for taking the time to explain everything from Jonah Hex to Billy the Kit to Standstill. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much, sir. I'm going to let you go. Have a great night and a great weekend, and I will update you when this posts, okay?
Sounds good, man. Thank you.
Well, thanks, buddy. Have a good night. Ciao for now.
Thank you. All right, bye.
Okay, bye.
And there you have it. I hope you learned a lot about the process of comic book writing. Thank you again to Justin Gray for taking the time to do this interview. If you viewers would like to learn more about his comics, then check out the links in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions, feedback, or suggestions for future videos, please let me know in the comment section down below. If you found this video helpful and you'd like me to keep making more, then please convey that to both me and the YouTube algorithm by hitting like, subscribe, and the bell icon for notifications. If you'd like to watch another helpful video from my channel, then simply check out the video suggestions that you'll see displayed on the next screen.